On Sunday mornings, we go through books of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, all of them. And we're currently on Sunday mornings going through the book of 2 Samuel in the Old Testament. But I'm going to take a step away from that this week for a special Thanksgiving message for you. So if we go back to the New Testament and join me in the book of Luke, chapter 7. So Luke chapter 7, and there's ushers coming down the aisles with Bibles. So we're going to cover quite a few verses here. So if you don't have a Bible, or you would like to borrow one or keep it, then just get their attention. And they even mark the place for you so that you can find it if you're not familiar with the scriptures. Luke 7, and we'll start in verse 36. While you're finding your way there, I was reminded that Thanksgiving is the time for excess, isn't it? You know, it's like too much of everything. There's too much pie. There's too much stuffing. Wives think there's too much football. Some of us think there's too much family. Some people the parents think kids have too much time off of school. It just goes on and on. But one thing we're rarely excessive about, and that's being thankful. I mean, think about it. We have to have one day set aside a year to remember to be thankful. And so as I was considering this teaching, I started to ask myself, can a person be too thankful? You know, I imagine a little boy praying. He's been given the honor to pray over the Thanksgiving meal. Maybe he's 6 or 7 years old, and he starts to pray for everything, you know. He prays for the green beans, and then he prays for the sweet potatoes, and then he prays for each one of his toys by name, and then he prays for Aunt Edna's hip surgery, and 10 minutes in, the parents are like, when is this going to stop? You know, because as we get older, we get cooler about our Thanksgiving, don't we? We sort of get this Thanksgiving filter, and it's like, well, let's be appreciative, but not too much. Well, all that to say, I don't think that we can be too thankful to God. And so what I did is I started looking around the Bible for grateful people. And I wanted to find the most grateful person in the Bible that I could find. And I think I found it here in Luke 7. Now, you may disagree, because there's lots of thankful people in the scriptures, and you might find someone that's more. But this gal is at least in the top 5, okay? So we'll stick with this. And what I want to do is use her example of gratitude to prove to you that you can never be too thankful to God. You can never be thankful enough. And actually, Jesus is going to let us know that it's okay to be embarrassingly grateful to God. And here's why. Because forgiven people are grateful people. You know, we used to sing this song when I was a new believer. It went, give thanks with a grateful heart. Give thanks to the Holy One. Give thanks because he's given Jesus Christ, his son. And, you know, I was singing that this morning in the shower because, that's what it's about. That's why forgiven people are grateful, because of what God has done for us, the huge amount that he's forgiven us of. And so, I'm going to show you and urge you to embrace the fact that you can never be too thankful to God. And so I'm going to break it up into 3 parts here. And the first part that we're going to look at is we're going to see the contrast. We're going to see a person who's not thankful at all. So number 1, we'll look at someone who's not thankful at all. And this is here to remind us to not be like him, okay? So let's review what it's not supposed to be before we talk about what it is. So starting in verse 36, here's what Luke said in chapter 7. He said, "Then one of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him. And he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat." Okay, if you'll allow me here for a moment, I'd like to give us some background on this. Set the context. In that day, in the ancient world, eating a meal with someone was a big deal. Today, not so much. But for the Jews in ancient Israel, eating with someone was a big deal because to them, you were like sharing yourself. They would sit at the table, and they didn't have, at that time, they wouldn't use utensils like you and I use today. So they would put all their food in the center. It was like family-style dining, but they would use their hands to get it, right? So imagine someone reaching in there and tearing off a hunk of bread, and then you're dipping it in the community sauces and oils and so forth. And so you germaphobes would be freaking out at this moment, right? Like, how can they do it? So the idea is that, you and I are exchanging things here, our germs, essentially, and we kind of become one with each other, in a sense. And that's the way that they thought. So that's the kind of a meal that they're sharing here in Luke chapter 7. And Jesus is invited to this meal, right? It seems like in the Bible that Jesus liked to have meals with people. Whenever he was invited, he went. Hey, Jesus, do you want to go to dinner with us? Sure. What time should I be there? It's like he will go. And so this Pharisee apparently wants to see what he's like or something, and he invites him to his house, and Jesus goes. Now, Pharisees were some of the Jewish religious leaders of the day. And what they took it upon themselves to do was watch the community closely to make sure that they obeyed the laws and the rituals and the traditions. Right? It was really important to them. They were very fired up that the community would keep all of those things. Now, here's the problem with the Pharisees, is they began to lose sight that they were sinners too, and they needed God's grace for themselves. And so they actually became judges of people instead of who they were supposed to be as a servant of God. So that's what Pharisees are, and one of them here invites Jesus to his house for dinner. Now, one more cultural thing before I go on. In their neighborhoods, they were really small. I've been to Israel, and you could go to some of these ancient sites, and the homes were close together, and the communities were tight, and they were open. It's not like today where you guys who have a home in the valley, they didn't have 6-foot-tall privacy fences and storm windows. You could just kind of look right in because the windows were open, except for maybe lattice over them, and they're all close together. And it was customary that whenever they would have a dinner like this, that it would actually be open to the community. You wouldn't be an invited guest to where you could eat, but you could watch and listen to the whole thing. So imagine this, the guests would sit at the table, and then you could just sit there and stare in the window and watch the whole thing. Isn't that weird? Or even they would let them come inside and stand around the wall of the dining area, right? Just checking out the whole thing. It's just so awkward to me, but that was their culture, right? So that's the scene. Here's this Pharisee getting a closer look at what Jesus is like. There's guests at the table, and then the neighbors are all poking their nose in, checking it all out. Okay, so what happens? Look at verse 37. It says, "And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner," you might want to circle that, "when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil and stood at his feet behind him weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wipe them with the hair of her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with the fragrant oil. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, 'This man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is who's touching him, for she's a sinner.'" All right, most scholars think that this gal was well known around town because of sexual sin. You know, Israel was conservative at that time, and as I said, the towns were small, and so a promiscuous gal would be known for this, right? And she would be looked down upon. Now, it's not so much like that today anywhere, really, but that's how it was in that day. It's what she's doing. It's not appropriate. It's not right. But look what's happening here. She's lavishing love upon Jesus, particularly his feet. Must have been quite a scene going on there. You know, I'm thinking it's got to be awkward for the others that are standing there watching it, because people are probably thinking, why doesn't she stop this? Why doesn't Jesus tell her to cut it out? I mean, if you could for a moment in your mind's eye, put yourself in that room. So you're in the dining room, you're looking at the guests, and they're all, you know, what they would do is recline. You know, they didn't sit at the dinner table like you do today. Typically, what they would do is they had a low table in the room, or a few of them around, like a horseshoe kind of a thing with the food in the middle. And they would recline on pillows, like on one arm, around the table, and then they would have their feet sticking out behind them. And so you're in the room, you're watching that, and then all of a sudden a woman, who everybody knows is not a good person, starts crying so much that her tears are running down her face, and she walks up behind Jesus and starts to touch him. And we're all like, what's she doing? And she's wetting his feet with her tears. Now, as a side note, do you know how much crying you'd have to do to wet somebody's feet with your tears? That's a lot of crying, isn't it? And then, did you see there? She wipes his dirty feet with her long hair. Yes, I said Jesus had dirty feet. He did. He walked around in sandals. She begins to kiss his feet. I mean, who knows how long that is going on here. Later, when we read Jesus talking about it, it seems like this was going on for a while. And then finally, she pours perfume on them. I bet you could hear a pin drop in that place. Wow, what's she doing? Now, the Pharisee is watching the whole thing. Did you see that? Later on, we'll come to find out that his name is Simon. And Simon starts to think to himself, if that guy Jesus is really who he says he is, a prophet and a rabbi, and knew who she is, he wouldn't let her touch him with a 10-foot pole. What's he doing? You see, a Pharisee believed that he was defiled by a Gentile or a sinner touching him. As a matter of fact, when they would go through the marketplace, they would take their robe and kind of wrap it close to them so that it wouldn't inadvertently swish against one of you sinners. Right? They didn't want to be defiled. And so here's Rabbi Jesus with this gal kissing his feet. He's probably like, ew, don't let her touch you. You know, when I was reading this, it reminds me that when somebody really worships Jesus, there's usually somebody who objects to it. You know what I'm talking about? You know, somebody who's really stoked for the Lord, there's usually somebody like rolling their eyes. And you see it in the Bible on a number of occasions where that happens. You know, in 2 Samuel, at some point, we'll get to where David is dancing before the Lord, and his wife takes exception to it, and it caused a big rift in their family because of it. And someone often objects when somebody is really worshiping God, and here it's Simon. And you know, we're going to come to find out why, and it's because he's not thankful to God like she is. But you see, she thinks that there's nothing too good for Jesus. and she's the one who's right. Well, what does Jesus have to say about this whole situation? Let's look at verse 40 together. He answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. So he said, Teacher, say it. Just let me stop for a moment here. Do you remember, if you go back to, where was it, verse 39? Simon didn't say this out loud. Remember, he just spoke it to himself in his heart. So you know what that means? Jesus knows what he's thinking. And this is good for all of us to know. Like, I don't know where you are in your relationship with God, but just know that anybody who thinks that they're keeping things to God because they just think them is like in for a big surprise. Because God knows everything. He knows the heart. He knows the thoughts and intents of our heart. You know, some of the religious rulers of that day thought that if I didn't actually take something, that I just thought it, then I wasn't really stealing. But if I'm thinking about stealing that, then I'm actually guilty of it. And that's the way that Jesus puts it in the Sermon on the Mount, that, you know, when my thought life also convicts me, and the Lord, I think it's way worse than what we actually do. And so, you know, the Lord reminds us of those things in the Scriptures, that, you know, we want to meditate on good things and Him. And so, a great reminder here, we've got Jesus looking into the guy's soul. And so, because he knows what Simon is thinking, he uses this as a teaching moment. That's great. Well, this is what he says, verse 41. There was a certain creditor who had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said to him, You have rightly judged. Okay, so Jesus uses this teaching moment to tell a parable. A little story about two people that owed the same person money. And he talks about a denarii. A denarii was approximately a day's wage. So you've got one person who owes 500 days' wages and one that owes 50. So one of them owes 10 times as much as the other person. And Jesus poses this simple question. If a creditor forgave both of those guys, which of them would be more grateful? And everybody knows which of these two ought to be more grateful, right? We know that. This is a no-brainer. You can spot these things a mile away. We can, you know, when things are really evident about gratitude, we can call that out. One of the things that I like to watch on the internet, I don't like much on the internet, but one of the things I do like is these videos where people barely escape crashes. Have you seen these things? Where, you know, like some kid will be bombing down a hill on a skateboard, heading towards an intersection, and you're like, oh no, oh no, oh no. And he gets in the intersection and just misses two cars, you know? And you're like, whoa, that guy is really lucky, and, you know, that kind of a thing. And you know, he should be grateful that he's not dead. I was reminded how years ago I was parked, sitting at a stoplight on Fairview and Meridian Road, that little intersection there, waiting to turn left. And this girl comes wheeling around the corner in a convertible Mustang, I think it was, and something happened. I think she must have hit the gas instead of the brake, and she ran into the curb right by me, and the car flipped over and landed on its roof, like 20 yards from me. And I've got my little daughter in the baby seat in the back, sitting in the left turn lane. So I throw the car into park and run over there, you know. Not really thinking clearly about my daughter in the back seat at the moment. I'll tell you that story some other time. So she's okay. But I get over to the car, and the wheels are still spinning because it just happened, And I look underneath because it's a convertible, so it's smashed down. And I look in there, and it's like a 16, 17-year-old girl who is freaking out, going, "My mom's going to kill me," And she's still buckled in the seatbelt. Now, it had one of those roll bars so that it didn't crush her, It was kind of tilted up. And she's yelling and upset that she's going to be in trouble by her parents. And I'm looking at her in like this much space, and I go, "You should thank God that you're not dead." And I just waited for the paramedics to get there. And, we all know that when we see these kind of things that people ought to be thankful. And so this parable, Jesus is using to get to the heart of Simon. You see, what Jesus is doing that is so smart is he's letting Simon be the judge in this moment. And he answers correctly. We saw that there. The one that's forgiven more loves more, right? You see, I think what Jesus is trying to do here is get Simon to see that he's not thankful at all. And God wants him to be thankful. Okay, so verse 44, it says, Jesus turned to the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil." In that culture, again, it's helpful to know some of the cultural things when you read the Bible. And you can get books and, of course, do this research yourself on the internet. It helps the Bible to become more alive to you, and put yourself in it. And in that culture, you would do 3 things to show kindness to a guest when they came to your house, to show respect. One was wash their feet, right? You'd wash their feet because, again, they would wear sandals or go barefoot. And the streets didn't have sidewalks. And so it would be dirty, and there wasn't really great sewer systems, and so there's trash, and it's gross. And so people's feet would be really dirty. That's why I said Jesus had dirty feet, because that's just what happened, So the homes, they would usually have a little basin by the door, and so that you could wash your feet. It was just a common courtesy, or they would have a servant wash them for you. The idea is to make you comfortable, to make you, that you're a guest. It would be like if I went to your house and you took my coat, and you say, "Hey, sit down, be welcome. Let me take your coat." It's just a common courtesy that you do. So that's one way to show respect or kindness to a guest. Another one you see there in verse 45 is to give him a kiss on the cheek. That's how they greeted one another. You and I don't do that really much. But with us, it's more like a handshake or a hug. We do the side hug a lot, kind of things too, right? And the idea is that you're not ignoring that person who's come into your home. You want to make them feel like respect, and you're being kind to them. And then the third way to show that is there in verse 46, and it's they would anoint their head with a little fragrant oil. They didn't shower all the time like you and I hopefully do, but they would, oftentimes they would do things to mask odors. Like they would use oils and that kind of thing, and it's sort of a refreshing thing for them too. It's like, relax. We're glad you're here. It would be like, again, if I went to your house and you gave me a cup of coffee or a glass of water, so just to refresh myself. Now, I say all that because Simon doesn't do any of that, right? I mean, just imagine Jesus coming into your house and you just ignore him. And that's what's happened here. And again, Simon represents somebody who's not thankful to God at all. And quite frankly, that's the human nature, is not to be thankful. And so he doesn't show any common courtesies, even though it's God's son. Wow, this is a huge mistake he's making. Okay, so that's our first part, and that's somebody who's not thankful at all. So let's turn now our attention to someone who's extremely thankful. So number 2, somebody who's extremely thankful. And remember, we're letting this prove to us that you can never be too thankful to God, right? You can never be thankful enough. And we're going to let her show us. And we've already looked at her a little bit, but a lot more in this section. You see, what's happened here is she is doing the things that Simon wouldn't. And in addition to that, she's going the extra mile. Right? She actually, she will only go down to his feet. She's like humbling herself. She's going much, much lower. It's as if she's saying, I don't want to go any higher, Lord. Just let me kiss your feet. What a display of love and thanksgiving from her. And did you see Jesus said there, in what we just read, verse 44, he said to Simon, take a good look at her. She is showering me with gratitude. You could say that she is actually embarrassingly thankful to Jesus in this moment. But Simon isn't at all. Oh, by the way, did you see that Jesus noticed everything that she did? He always does. I think that sometimes we keep our service to the Lord, our sacrifice to Him, our commitment to Him, to ourselves because we think that maybe He doesn't see it. Or unless that someone else notices it, it's not worth doing it or something like that. But just know that, one of the results of being, never being too thankful to God is that you can't outgive Him. It's not like He's going to be like, wow, you did so much, I could never pay you back. It's not like that at all. You can never outgive God. And so it's good to serve Him with your whole life, and He will notice everything you do. You never need to be concerned that He doesn't see everything, and keep track of it all, because He does. And I gotta admit to you, I'm teaching this mostly for me. I love her over-the-top attitude. It really convicts me. This gal has no fear about showing her appreciation for Jesus. There's like no boundaries to it. It's like she's saying, I don't care what anybody else thinks about me. I am just going to worship and serve and love and be thankful to my King. And you know what? I think we would be really wise if we listened to what Jesus said to Simon. And as He said, take a good look at her. Look at how she's loving me. Look at how what she does convicts me that I should be more like her and not, care really what other people think about my worship of God. Well, look what Jesus says next, verse 47. He says, therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Okay, I really like this because what Jesus does is acknowledge what everybody in the room is thinking. He says, oh, by the way, I know she's a sinner, you guys. I know who she is. I know what she's done. I know she's done a lot of things wrong. But here's why she showed so much gratitude. She understands how much she's been forgiven of, even if it's just she understands a little of it, you know. She loves Jesus for what he's forgiven her of. She knows. You know, I imagine a young man who's come from a ruined life, and I've met lots of guys like this, and they're like, the Son of God accepts me even though I'm a loser. It's like that. And God loves losers like me. But Simon, he hasn't acknowledged his guilt and been forgiven. If he had, he would love the Lord as much as she did, or maybe more. So I think that Jesus is implying here that we can all know a level of forgiveness that she does, or maybe even greater, and love him very much, right? But some people, he said, love little. I was watching a movie with my family recently. It was one of those pure flicks, faith-based movies, you know, and I think it was called Do You Believe? I can't remember the title of it. But there's this scene when this guy's in the hospital, this Christian guy, and he wakes up, he's you know, really injured. Something was wrong with him, I can't remember. And when he wakes up, the first thing that he does is give thanks to God. Now, his doctor was atheist, and his doctor says, why is he thanking God? I'm the one who did it. and that's like Simon. You know, that doctor didn't thank anyone but himself. And Simon is focused on himself. And then, you know what? That's the way we start off, isn't it? We're the center of the world. Everything revolves around us. And then, you know where that goes after that? Is we don't really like it. Like in that movie, that guy didn't like it that he felt forgiven by God either. And people don't like it when sinners are forgiven. I like how William MacDonald put it. He said, the natural heart hates grace. And I agree with him. We don't understand God's grace. The Pharisees hated the grace that Jesus would give people. And that's one of the reasons why they put him to death. They just hated him for what he stood for, the grace of God. So it's really compelling to me how Jesus connects gratitude and love here. Somebody said this is a love scene with a whole bunch of thanksgiving mixed in. It kind of is. He seems to be saying that being thankful for forgiveness of sin should be as common as if you were being forgiven of a big debt. If you're forgiven of a big debt, of course you'd be grateful. You homeowners, you guys, I should say you homeowners with a mortgage. Let's say that today you left here and you were heading out to your car and somebody comes up to you and goes, hey, I saw the balance on your mortgage and here's a check for the money to pay it off right here. Go ahead, go to the bank, pay it off. I mean, you would be high-fiving everybody in sight if that happened to you, right? Yeah, high-fiving, just like that. Because you'd be grateful, and you ought to be grateful because you no longer have that big debt. I mean, you know, I don't know how much you owe, but it could be a lot. Well, my debt, your debt, our sin debt load of sin is much bigger than that. And if you're a Christian today, if you've received Christ as your Savior, you've been forgiven a lot more than a mortgage. And it ought to show in your gratitude towards God. You should love him a lot. And that's the whole point of this. But you know, I'm a guy, and I know that gratitude makes us uncomfortable sometimes. Because it starts when we're little, right? You moms, you have to say, now go tell your grandma thank you for the bunny slippers. Go tell her. You have to be taught to be thankful, you know, and to say thank you. It doesn't come naturally. It's difficult to get adults to say thank you sometimes. I mean, how many men do you think write thank you cards in the United States? There's not many. I don't know that I've ever really written one. I would say that most people don't really like to express gratitude because it goes against our nature. So we need to be taught different. And as a believer, we need to be taught what God expects from us. And I think that he expects us to be extremely thankful, that that's who would be who we are. And so we've just looked at that example of this gal who's an example of somebody who's extremely thankful, even embarrassingly so. Good for her. Okay, well, there's one more part I'd like to look at with you as we kind of start to wind down, and that is to apply it to ourselves. Number 3 is, how can we express thanks to God more? We should be thinking it. How can we, in our everyday life, express thanks to God more? Well, it's very simple, and I think here it is, right here. I'll answer that question for you. Do it by faith. Do it by faith. I mean, don't you think that she had to have faith to do what she did? Everybody's going to make fun of me if I give thanks to God openly. Who cares what people think? You know, in the end, do you know who you answer to? You answer to God. He's the judge of all things. You don't answer in the end to your spouse or your parents or your friends. And so it's okay to be embarrassingly thankful to God. So what if it's unbecoming of your stature? Who cares? Just remember what God has done for you. You know, you go to Thanksgiving this Thursday, a meal, and maybe it's at a place where there's not much thanks being given to God. Why don't you do it? Who cares what they think? Now, I should say something very important as we look at this section, because this doesn't mean that you don't need to go and destroy yourself to love God a lot. Do we get that? That's not what Jesus is saying here. And here's why. Because as far as God is concerned, all of us fall way short of the glory of God. You know, 3 different times in the Bible, it says that there is none good, no, not one. 3 different times. That means nobody is inherently good in and of themselves. Simon loves little because he doesn't think that he's in debt to God. He thinks he's good. Just like in our community here. You know, you guys live in a community where there's a lot of folks who are kind of good, you know. You got people, people flock to the Treasure Valley because for the most part, folks are honest here, you know. They take care of their stuff. You go to their business. They're not going to really cheat you. People kind of live a quiet, good life here. But you know, often those are the ones who don't have a sense of their need for God. And it's because they believe that they're a good person. Now, Jesus is very critical of folks like that. And a good example of that is in the book of Revelation in chapter 3, when he's talking to this church of this place in Laodicea. And he's critical of them, and he says, because you say you don't have need of anything. And what he's talking about is a spiritual need. They didn't think they had a spiritual need. He goes, don't you know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked? Don't you know you have a great spiritual need and you won't come to me to be forgiven for that, you know? And that's the call that goes out to our world. And that's us Christians, you guys that are believers today, we're the agents for that, to remind people that they have a great spiritual need, even if they're kind of a nice, good person. God says there's none that are good. No, not one. Well, then look at verse 48, and we'll start to wind down here. It says, he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And those who sat at the table with him began to say to themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Then he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. The other guests are like, what did he say? Who does he think he is? So Jesus takes the whole gratitude and love thing even further, and he explains what happens to people who acknowledge God's grace towards them, and that is that he forgives all of their sins, because he and he alone has the power to take them all away. Now, I've been emphasizing being thankful here today, and it's good. But notice, this is very important. If you haven't been listening until now, please listen to this. Notice that it's not her gratitude that saves her. It's her faith in Jesus. You see, the thanks and the love that she displays are because she's forgiven. Jesus is the one who saves her, and Jesus is the one who saves us. And what's more, she's the only one here who doesn't say anything. Everybody else is talking. She's just busily thanking God by worshiping him. She lets her actions do the talking. And I love this about her because, do you know, it's pretty hard to hide grateful faith. I know some really grateful people, some people that are really grateful to God. And when I talk to them and see them in action, they can't hide it because it just comes out of us. And that's what's happening to her. She knows she's forgiven. And you know, we can look like a goof being thankful to God because it requires taking a risk. But so what? So what if you look like a goof? She's a great example of somebody who's taking a risk by faith. Now, the incredible thing is that the pardon from Jesus was offered to both of them, but only one has accepted it so far. And it's offered to you too. If you're not a Christian yet, just know that that same pardon that she is so excited about is offered to you as well. You see, the Bible warns us that there's a judgment coming. There just is. And the Apostle Paul says that there's two things that will characterize the people who are judged by God at the great white throne. Number one, that they didn't glorify God. And number two, they weren't thankful to God. You see, those two things go hand in hand. Faith and gratitude. Will you guys look at that last part of verse 50 with me again? Look what he said to her. He said, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. What a blessing to her and anybody who puts their faith in Jesus. The only way you can avoid the turmoil of being at war with God is to believe in the one whom he sent. And he offers the free gift of eternal life and all the hope that goes with it if you will put your trust in God's only Son, Jesus. But many people are like Simon, and they're covering it up. But that's a dangerous place to be. Look how Proverbs puts it. I want to show you this one last verse from Proverbs 28:13. Look how the wisdom there is stated. It says, he who covers his sins will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. There's a scary thing there, and there's a great thing there. Simon was not going to prosper, and he's not going to receive mercy from God. But she is, and anyone can. And you know how? Again, the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 10 that if you will confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That whosoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And then, as Jesus said there in verse 50, you can go in peace because you're forgiven. You can live your life in gratitude towards the Lord. And I pray for you, my friend, that you've experienced that grace of God. I don't know where you're at with your relationship with God. Maybe you've been faking it. Maybe you used to be really close to the Lord and you've gone way away from him. Maybe you don't, this is the first time you're hearing it. Just know that that grace is for all people, but you've got to take a step of faith yourself. And I pray that you would even today. So, for me, this lady proves that you can never be too thankful to God. What do you think? Did she prove it to you? I see a few heads. Maybe she didn't. But how about if I ask it this way? Is there room in your heart to express more gratitude to the one who has forgiven you so much? I hope there is. I want that to be for me. So maybe while you're enjoying your, on Thursday, your third piece of pie, or your second turkey drumstick, you got them both this year, you know? Maybe you could remember just how much God has forgiven you. And you might in your heart just express your love and devotion to him.